Yes, Paul.
A hearing aid will correct your hearing loss.
That's right. It's a magic cure for hearing loss. Put those bad boys on.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you talk louder, they can hear you.
And if you talk like
Slower.
this,
Slower.
then they understand.
All them people can read lips.
Yes, yes, that's the one I was waiting for. That's normally the one we get first. Which you probably haven't heard that lip reading has about a 35% accuracy rate on a good day. Most people are not Sue Thomas, FBI. And I probably just dated us by using that reference.
And related to that, speaking of lip reading, for myself, and I'm sure there are other deaf people who feel the same, but I'm not speaking for them, I'm speaking for myself at this point. Lip reading is a skill that requires a lot of training. There's a lot to be learned. But I always, with lip reading, I feel like I'm playing a game of fill in the blanks. I'll catch a word here, I'll miss a couple, I'll catch another one. So there's a lot of filling in the blanks to try and figure out what's been said. And filling in a blank, sometimes I'm right and sometimes I'm wrong. How do I know? And sometimes when responding to a question, it can be a challenge. Sometimes it's something that can be easily understood, but it really depends. It varies from individual to individual. First of all, if you've got a man with a beard, there's no way I can lip read him. I'm sorry. Secondly, if let's say if you've got in Asian culture, oftentimes you will find people who speak with a stiff upper lip, which makes it very difficult to read because there's no movement there. So that can be another challenge. So there are a lot of reasons why lip reading can be challenging.
So Botox is not your friend.
Yeah, and that's another possibility too.
Yeah. So in order for time, we're going to save on introductions, and we've already got your experiences. Okay. So a couple of basic etiquette tips that we've already started talking about. We want this to be interactive, so please chime in throughout the course of our discussion today. Jared mentioned a few minutes ago, lip reading. Even with those people who do read lips and they say it may be okay, you want to make sure that you keep eye contact with people who have hearing loss. You want to be face to face with them. Even if they're not solely dependent upon your lips, if you are interacting with them, your body language, your facial expressions are important. They're reading you up and down before you've decided anything about them. They already know probably your attitude, if you're open to working with them or if you're already hesitant. If you feel an awkwardness already and are kind of nervous, they're in tune with that. Just because they depend so heavily on their visual cues of body language. Please don't say impaired. We probably should have put that first, actually. Except for your sign impaired, yes, Raj. There's no reverse discrimination here. You are not a protected class. So, that works. For example, working with our clients, if you call a potential employer and you say, hey, I have this great guy, a great client, he can do this, he's got a bachelor's degree, whatever, and he's hearing impaired, but he can still da-da-da-da, then that employer already has said, something's wrong, he's broke, we can't fix it, there's an impairment. So just that one vocabulary word carries so much power. So essentially, deafness is acceptable and hard of hearing is acceptable. Most of the time you want to shoot for person first language, and it's a person with hearing loss. I'm working with a client who happens to have hearing loss, and then you go from there. If a person comes in your door and they say, hi, my name is, and I'm hard of hearing in one ear, and I can't hear out the other, remain calm. It's okay. Just keep the patient's You know, keep everything at a calm level and really just open up with them like you would any other client. Try to remove physical barriers within the conversation. Jared mentioned beards, mustache, some people. If you are a gum person, if you're a nail biter, if you are working on your computer trying to do an intake and you're trying to listen to what's going on and what they're saying to you, your attention is elsewhere. And whatever you have going on visually, they're picking up on those cues versus being squared up with your client. In counseling, you may have learned a term called squared up. And that's where your hips and your shoulders are squared up with your client. That starts the connection and that starts the rapport. Because if you are otherwise engaged, then they're floating out in space and not in tune with you. Also, physical barriers could be a large picture of your cat on your desk. You know, I mean, I hate to be nitpicky, but and please don't come in my office. Do what I say, not what I do. Yes, please don't come in my office. If you do visit the wrong office, please give me a couple days' notice. Because if I have a file stacked on my desk right there, that's very distracting, and that's in between us if we're trying to have a conversation. Even though it might not be in their line of sight, but they have to process all of that in front of them. If you have a window behind you, the lighting, if the lighting is glaring behind you and they have to look and concentrate at that, that's a physical barrier, and that's a hindrance to your conversation.
And if I may, speaking of body language, as she mentioned, a lot of deaf people use body language. It's visual cues for them, and they're really important because they do show attitude. If you're not attending in a way that's visible to them, it's going to be interpreted as just that, not putting attention or paying attention to the client, and the client's going to feel they're not being taken seriously or they're not being listened to. So this squaring off and that sort of eye contact and direct focus on your client shows that we're paying attention and that we're not tending to whether it's typing or paperwork or something else. Because if you're doing that, it may be interpreted as me as a VR person not being willing to work with them. So body language is critical sometimes when you're working with a deaf or hard of hearing client. And you know, the deaf person is often looking at the interpreter, but sometimes the hearing people will too. And you need, as a hearing person there, to focus in on the deaf client and have that eye contact and be squared off with them and tend to them, not to the interpreter. And the reason I say that is eye contact is vital. And I've experienced a lot of situations, for example, let's say I went into Burger King to order some food. And I say I need indicate I need a pen and paper. I immediately see the reaction, the attitude of the individual behind the counter. They may roll their eyes. They may look me up and down in judgment right away. You can see it immediately. They immediately think I'm dumb just because I asked for pen and paper to write my order down on. Another time I've tried it and I signed to the person instead of asking for pen and paper. And that person's reaction was completely opposite. They were like a deer in headlights. And they were, oh, what do I do? What do I do? So they you know, held up a finger, I'll be back, and then they walked away. But perception is important, and you can see those visual cues, that body language can really indicate attitude to a deaf person.
Have you ever had, Jared, have you ever had the interpreter say something like, tell him, da, 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 you know, or tell him I want to do this, or tell him? So that's another thing.
All of the time.
I know
And
for...
on the phone. A lot on video phone calls. I may be calling the insurance company or something, I'm talking with a representative, and the representative will say, tell him. And it's like, no, 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 you can talk to me just as you would any other person. You don't need to speak in third person reference.
For us hearing folks, it's our first reaction, especially with an interpreter, because we know that they're relaying our information to the consumer or the client. So really, like Jared mentioned, eye contact with the client. Don't worry about the interpreter. They will keep doing their job as they should. I'm going to add a comment on that just popped up also. But you don't have to say tell him or tell her. They're going to do that regardless. And if you do say tell him or tell her, they're going to let the deaf person know that you're talking to them in that way. Part of the interpreter's role is to convey the attitude and is to convey all aspects of the language. So if you are kind of snarky, like I can be from time to time, the interpreter better put that emphasis on that. You know, and if you but that is one way you will know. You can gauge the accuracy of the tone. You may not be able to engage or gauge the accuracy of the fluency of language, but you will see the delivery in that. I mean, I've been in situations where a deaf person is just boo-hooing and crying on the phone. I know this. I can follow my gut and know on the phone, but the relay interpreter is very flat. So if the video phone interpreter is flat and they're telling me about their dog died and they can't come into work, and you know, I just really question the qualification and the skill level of that interpreter. That's just part of what they do. That was a freebie right there. We'll keep moving. Oh, the last one on here is reinforced communication with notes. Generally, writing notes and writing back and forth is a last resort. It's kind of unpersonalized. I mean, it's you know, especially if you're coming up to the front window, the client's like, hey, I'm deaf. Then you automatically grab it as your first instinct. And then you push it across the window and you're like, what do you want? Yeah, you know. And then you get it back and you realize, what kind of sentence was that? Have you seen that? Has anybody ever questioned the English of that? So writing back and forth with a consumer who uses ASL is really in their second language. So it's not effective communication always. I use notes. So for example, if I ask a question, you know, who is your audiologist? What did you do? Where did they live? You know, then I may go audiologist address, just to make sure they're understanding me. And so it's abbreviated notes, and it's really reinforcement. It's not for effective communication. It's just adding to that. Especially if I give my client homework. If I give my client homework and I want to make sure I'm asking them to bring me 3 job references or 3 job listings, then I'm going to make notes about that for them. But that's kind of their to-do list. That's not how we exchange and interact in the full intake.
So for the purpose of communication, pen and paper or your hand, you don't want anything in front of your mouth when you're speaking. You don't want any, especially and if they're depending on an interpreter. And oftentimes the deaf person is going to focus on the interpreter. They're not going to be looking at you directly. That's not intended to be offensive. They need to do that in order to see what's being said by the interpreter. So a typical person like you all visually relies on about 30% of their visual field. They're really tending to about that much because they're focusing relying much more on what they hear in their environment as opposed to what they see. Well, deaf people don't do that. We have much broader use of our periphery or our peripheral vision, and so I know what's going on over here with the interpreter. I can see them sign even though I'm not looking directly at them, because I'm using my peripheral vision. So I can catch that as a deaf person. And it may sometimes seem that, well, why is it Jerry looking at the interpreter? Well, I actually can do both. I can look at you and the interpreter in my peripheral vision. And speaking of perceptions of a deaf person, the deaf person does rely on their visual skills. For example, with driving, I pay attention on the road. I can almost sense when another car comes into my space, or even looks like they might, because I'm using a broader peripheral vision, I'm very sensitive to that. So I can avoid accidents, I can avoid other people on the road much better. So that's just an example. Mouth movement when you speak with a deaf person, obviously speak normal. Do not over enunciate or over exaggerate your mouth movements. Can you read lip? No, that's over. And you know, for me, I mean, it makes it a very awkward situation for me looking. So speak normally. Speak normally. Any other comments you wanted to add related to that?
No, I think I jumped the gun on that one, and I think we have that one addressed.
We're looking at about 48 million people with hearing loss, and about 20% of those Americans, that's what we're looking at, report some hearing loss. And that 20% isn't really accurate. And the reason I say that is, well, you have those who have identified their hearing loss and identify as either being deaf or hard of hearing, and that may be a lifelong thing for them. But let's say it's someone who's late deafened, or they're losing their hearing later in life. Let's say, you know, at age 14, let's say they start to lose their hearing. They're not going to admit that. There's going to be denial associated with that. Again, the 7 stages of grief, just as with any other situation of loss. So you've got denial, and then you will have withdrawal from society. They're no longer as involved with their friends anymore. You'll see a lot of symptoms until finally they reach the point where they have to accept that they need help. And studies show that it takes about 7 years before they will finally admit and ask for help. That's for most people who have some sort of hearing loss. So think about that. 7 years, and let's say it happened at 14 years old. So by the time they're 21, think of all the situations and the frustrations that they've gone through from 14 to age 21 before they finally admit they need help. Situations with parents, relationships, all sorts of things. There's a variety of factors that come into play and affect that person and their experience. And it takes them that long before they finally realize they need help, which may mean voc rehab. It may mean, you know, going to an audiologist and seeing what the next step is. So age is one of the highest factors there, because you've got a lot of baby boomers, and we're seeing hearing loss there in that group. 1 out of 3 has a hearing loss. I had one client who I was counseling previously who came to me and was 74 years old and was working as a truck driver and needed a hearing aid. So I said, fine, I'll support you in that, let's go. I worked with him as a client, I got him the hearing aid. I said, you need anything else? He said, no, fine, that met his need. And it's that easy for some people, I guess. But for others, not so much. And that's going to be a case-by-case, individual-by-individual basis. What is needed? It may just be the hearing aid, it may be a number of other things. So you really have to negotiate with them and get to know them in order to help them. A hearing aid won't just fix their problem.
And medically, looking at the audiogram, you could have 2 very similar audiograms of 2 separate clients, and you would expect they would function in the same way. That is not always true. their cultural background, their family support, their coping skills. There are a plethora of factors that play into how they handle dealing with their hearing loss. I know some of you are probably thinking about your spouse already. You've been yelling at them for years, 7 years at least, and you can't get them. Oh, and that's what's wrong. They've got hearing loss. You should probably get their hearing checked. As a matter of fact, I strongly encourage all of you to have your hearing assessed. You would be surprised. Now with teenagers, get ready, because within 7 years from now, these teenagers are going to be coming to us. Would anybody like to guess why? Earbuds.
Yep.
Direct noise exposure in the ear canal. So caution your children, maybe not use the Apple ones, or something, and make sure that their volume is appropriate. Just be sensitive to that, please. I think we kind of covered this as well.
Yeah, there's one other example that you may be aware of. A person who's hearing loss in one ear, but not in the other. That can be, but it's still, they would qualify for services because it's a functional limitation. If they can't hear on one side, they do not know always the direction that the sound is coming from. So they may need a hearing aid. If they're on the phone, they're not going to hear out of that ear. They won't hear someone else approach them. They've got the phone in the good ear and can't hear anything from the other. So they have a hearing aid it's a type of hearing aid called a bicross. And that's for someone who may be profoundly deaf in one ear but have maybe a mild to moderate loss in the other, enough that the hearing aid would allow them to have some conversation maybe. And the reason they call it a bicross, the deaf ear can actually pick up sound, and then by wirelessly or Bluetooth, it's transmitted to the ear that has some residual hearing. So it's actually picking up sound on the side with the profoundly deaf ear and sending it to the other side.
So you notice some of the barriers that we have been discussing today. Language access is a huge barrier to employment for those who use American Sign Language. Not so much with those who are hard of hearing, but definitely with people who use sign language. Cultural attitudes. You will come to learn if you visit us in the next 6 modules that there is a capital D deaf and there is a lowercase d deaf. A capital D is a person who identifies within the deaf culture. They associate with deaf people all the time. They may have gone to a school for the deaf. They may have graduated from Gallaudet or NTID. They may, they live a life in the deaf community. And essentially what ties them together is American Sign Language. Just like people who are in Kenya, they have their own languages based on their tribes. Well, a tribe, the language is essential. It's a cornerstone for culture. So with the deaf community, American Sign Language ties them together. However, an audiogram of a person who is capital D deaf may still have residual usable hearing. They can still speak for themselves when they so choose. If they are one-on-one, then they can use their voice. But their primary mode of language access is American Sign Language. For those who are lowercase d, they may be medically deaf. On the audiogram, there's no hearing or very little hearing, usable, functional hearing. But maybe they still speak for themselves. They use a CapTel telephone. They rely upon caption and cart, and they may not sign. Attitudes. We could go on and on about the attitudes and perceptions of others. We know really that sometimes our clients, their deafness is not really the barrier to employment. It might be the attitude of others. That's the barrier here. Accommodations. Kind of ties in with attitude sometimes. Because if we call a potential employer and we say, hey, I have a deaf client who, has applied for your job and has an interview on Tuesday, we want to help get an interpreter. The first response out of that employer is, I'm going to have to pay for an interpreter. How much is this going to cost me? No, let's take it one at a time. Let's talk about the options. They don't need an interpreter with them 8 to 5. They don't need an interpreter there. They can perform the essential functions of that job. But really, it's just education. The employers don't know that yet. And with that comes fear. What if?
Let me share something, a little bit of a background or history, if you don't mind, that you keep in the back of your mind as you work with deaf and hard of hearing clients. But I think it's kind of important. Back then, in ancient Greece, you had Aristotle and Plato and Archimedes and all of those philosophers, right? And one of them, I don't remember which one said this quote specifically, but it was a quote from one of them. And this is how far it goes back. What makes humans different from animals? The answer to that was language, speech. Now at that time, they didn't know at the time what that looked like. They assumed that, taking that quote, that, deaf people can't speak, they don't have language, therefore they must be equal to animals. That mentality has carried over and haunted us to this very day. And American Sign Language wasn't recognized as an actual language until the 1970s. And it was noted that it had its own syntax, its own grammatical structure. It was its own language. But there was no evidence of that prior to. So they weren't viewed as having language. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about perceptions and attitudes, myths and fears. There's a long history there that perpetuates some of those fears.